The locket left a mark. Not a scar, not a bruise, something subtler than either. A circle pressed into the skin just below the collarbone, the size of a thumbnail, faintly pink at the edges where the metal had been held too long and too hard against living flesh. Silas Hawthorne had been pressing that locket against his chest every night for 8 years, and every morning the mark was there, and every morning he did not look at it, and every morning it faded by noon, and every evening he pressed it again. It was the most consistent thing in his life, more consistent than weather, more consistent than the seasons that came and went across the three peaks of the Montana mountains that rose behind his ranch like sentinels guarding something that no longer needed guarding because there was nothing left inside worth protecting. 8 years, 8 summers of silence, 8 winters of frost on the window glass and wind through the gaps in the roof that nobody else heard because there was nobody else to hear. He had built this house with his brothers Caleb and Jonah when they were young men full of plans and the particular certainty that belongs only to people who have not yet been broken by the world. 3 peaks, 3 brothers, 1 ranch. They felled the timber, dug the foundations, sank the wells, and raised the walls with their own hands. Silas married Meg in the second year. She planted tomatoes in the garden and laughed at everything and embarrassed him regularly in front of the other settlers. And the house was loud and warm and full of the kind of noise that makes a house a home. Then the Elk Creek Massacre happened, 14 years ago now, the summer of 1860. A raiding party swept through the valley in the hours before dawn, and by the time the sun came up, 11 settlers were dead and the smoke from burning homesteads could be seen for 20 miles. Silas was 23. He fought alongside Caleb, who was 19, and both of them carried marks from that night that would never fully heal. The bullet grazed on Silas's left shoulder. The knife wound across Caleb's ribs, thin and white now, but still visible when the light caught it right. They fought and they survived, and Meg survived too. Silas had hidden her in the root cellar with Jonah, who was 15 and too young to fight, and old enough to hear everything that happened above him through the floorboards. Meg held Jonah's hand in the dark. She sang to him quietly so the raiders would not hear. Her voice did not shake. They rebuilt after the massacre. That was what people did on the frontier. You buried the dead and you repaired the walls, and you went on because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a luxury that the land did not offer. 6 years passed, good years mostly. Ezra was born, the ranch grew, the cattle multiplied. Silas watched his wife read to their son every night, with different voice for every character, and he watched her tend the tomatoes she was so proud of, and he watched her grow round with their second child, and he thought with the dangerous confidence of a man who has survived the worst thing he can imagine, that the worst was behind them. Meg died 11 days after giving birth to Rosie. Not violence this time. Not raiders or gunfire or anything a man could fight. Fever. The quiet, methodical, unstoppable kind that begins as warmth and ends as fire and takes everything between. Silas sat beside her bed for 11 days and watched the light in her eyes dim. Not all at once like a candle blown out, but slowly by degrees, like a candle burning down to the end of its wick. He held her hand. He told her things he had never said when she was well, because that is what people do when time runs out and the words that were always there suddenly become urgent. On the 11th day, she looked at him and said 2 words, "Mind the children," and she closed her eyes. The massacre taught Silas Hawthorne that the world was dangerous. The death of his wife taught him something worse. It taught him that even when you keep the people you love safe from violence, you can still lose them. That there is no wall high enough, no fence strong enough, no amount of vigilance sufficient to prevent the quiet catastrophes. The ones that come not with gunfire, but with fever. Not with warning, but with 11 days of watching and waiting and knowing. After Meg died, Silas began the slow, deliberate process of turning himself into a structure that kept the weather out and nothing else in. He stopped talking, not all at once, but gradually the way a river dries in drought. First the long conversations went, then the short ones, then the greetings, the small courtesies, the nods and half smiles that constitute the social currency of a small frontier town. Within a year, the people of Elk Hollow had learned that trying to reach Silas Hawthorne was like trying to hold water in a closed fist. He slipped through every gap before you knew you had lost him. Within 2 years, they stopped trying. Old Emmett Burke, who sat outside the barbershop every morning in the same cracked wooden chair, used to call out, "Morning Hawthorne, fine day." And Silas used to dip his hat without breaking stride. Eventually, Emmett stopped calling and started staring at his boots instead. It was not that they disliked him. It was that the space inside Silas Hawthorne was occupied by something old and cold and refusing, and there was nothing anyone could do or say that would change it. He was 37 years old, and he moved through the world like a ghost that had forgotten it was supposed to haunt someone. The locket was Meg's. He pressed it against his palm every night in the dark, a habit so old and so deeply grooved into his body that he no longer knew he was doing it. Inside the locket was her face. Behind her face, folded into a square so small it seemed impossible that it could contain words, was a letter she had written in the last days of her life, when the fever had taken her body but not yet her mind. She had slipped it into the locket while he slept and said, "Don't read it unless you need to." He had never read it. 8 years, and he had carried her last words without letting them reach him, because he was afraid that whatever she had written would change something he was not ready to change. On the hottest July morning in 20 years, his youngest brother Jonah rode into Elk Hollow to meet a stagecoach carrying a woman none of them had ever seen. And everything that had been sealed began against every effort and intention to open. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. Standing at the end of a dirt road in Montana Territory watching three enormous men walk toward her, Clara Whitfield understood that the advertisement had left out several important details. 9 days of travel, train from Boston to Chicago, Chicago to Omaha, Omaha to Helena by rail rattling through grasslands so vast they made her chest ache with something that was not quite loneliness and not quite awe but lived somewhere between the two. Then 2 days by stagecoach over roads that barely deserved the name roads, that felt like the land itself was trying to shake her loose to test whether she was serious about this, to see if she would turn back. She did not turn back. Her navy traveling dress was wrinkled beyond salvation. Her honey blonde hair, once pinned carefully in the modest updo she had spent 20 minutes on in a Helena boarding house mirror, had surrendered to the heat and the dust, and the relentless jolting of the coach and soft tendrils had escaped around her face and temples in a way she would have found mortifying in Boston and now simply did not have the energy to care about. Her mother's cameo brooch sat at her throat, the one thing about her appearance that remained exactly as she had placed it, because some things refuse to be disturbed no matter what the road does. She was exhausted. She was frightened. She was also, for the first time in her 22 years, free. Every decision that led her here was her own. Not her Aunt Prudence's, the woman who had raised her after her mother died in childbirth and her father died of consumption when Clara was 15, the woman who viewed Clara as unpaid domestic labor and planned to marry her off to a wealthy widower, twice her age, who looked at her like she was furniture he was considering purchasing. Not the society that had decided a girl without a fortune was a girl without choices. Hers. Every mile of track, every bump of road, every hour of dust and heat and uncertainty. Hers. The advertisement had been simple. Hawthorne Ranch, Montana Territory. 3 brothers seek a wife. Good land, honest work, children in need of a mother's care. Character valued above all. Respond with letter of introduction to J. Hawthorne, Elk Hollow, Montana. She had read it 7 times. She had written her response that night by candlelight in the attic room. Her aunt gave her the one with the draft that made her hands ache every winter. She described herself honestly. Educated, capable, unafraid of hard work, without family or fortune but in possession of a strong mind and a will to match. She did not mention that she was beautiful because she did not think of herself that way, and because beauty in the world she came from had only ever been a liability. The wrong kind of attention from men, the wrong kind of suspicion from women. Jonah's letters back had been warm, slightly rambling, and honest in a way that made her trust him before she had any reason to. He described the ranch, the mountains, the children. He described his brothers in brief, careful terms. Silas is the eldest. He does not talk much, but he means well. Caleb is the middle one. He will take some warming up to, but he is the most loyal man I have ever known. He described himself as the one who does the talking for the family, which my brothers consider both a gift and a curse. What he had not described in any of his 4 letters was the precise physical reality of 3 Hawthorne brothers standing together. Clara stepped off the stagecoach in Elk Hollow and saw Jonah first because Jonah was the one who came. He was standing beside a wagon hat in his hand, and he was enormous. Not merely tall, but built on a scale that made the wagon behind him look like something from a children's toy shop. Dark blonde hair catching the afternoon light, a crooked smile that was clearly trying to be reassuring and was clearly aware that his physical presence was accomplishing the opposite. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne." "Jonah, please. Mr. Hawthorne sounds like my brother, and trust me, you do not want that confusion on your first day." He lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing and set it in the wagon. He talked during the entire ride to the ranch, about the weather, about the road conditions, about the wildflowers that bloom in the mountain meadows in August, about a bear that raided their honey stores last month, about Rosie's ongoing campaign to name every animal on the ranch. He talked with the fluency of a man filling a space he knew would otherwise be terrifying. Clara listened. She watched the mountains rise around them blue-green, with pines streaked with snow, at the highest peaks even in July, and she felt the scale of what she had done settle into her body for the first time. She was 2,000 miles from everything she knew. She was in a wagon with a man she met 5 minutes ago. She was going to live with 3 men she had never seen. She pressed her mother's cameo brooch against her collarbone, a habit so old she no longer noticed it, and she breathed, and she did not let the fear show. The ranch appeared around a bend in the mountain road. A large log cabin with a covered porch, a barn, a stable, a woodshed, a chicken coop, fenced pastures stretching toward the base of 3 connected peaks that rose behind the property like guardians. The land was vast and wild and beautiful enough to hurt. And standing on the porch arms, crossed face unreadable, was the largest man Clara had ever seen. "That is Silas," Jonah said, and his voice had changed. Not the easy warmth of the ride, but something more careful. "He takes a while. Do not take it personally." Beside Silas, leaning against the porch railing with the studied casualness of a man who wanted you to know he was armed and alert, was Caleb. Chestnut hair, sharp hazel eyes. The kind of face that was evaluating you for threat level before it decided whether to bother with a greeting. Clara stepped down from the wagon. She stood in the yard. She looked up at the 2 men on the porch and the one beside her, and for one terrible, honest moment, she understood exactly how small she was. 5 feet 3 inches of Boston orphan in a dusty dress standing before 3 mountain men who looked like they had been carved from the landscape itself. She lifted her chin. She squared her shoulders. She walked toward the porch. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, looking directly at Silas, "I am Clara Whitfield. I have come a long way, and I would appreciate a glass of water and a straight answer about what exactly I have agreed to." Silas looked at her. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, something happened that he would spend the next 6 weeks trying to undo. He saw her eyes, and they were looking at him the way no one had looked at him in 8 years, directly, without flinching, without the sideways nervousness that people use when they are afraid of what they will find. She was clearly terrified. She was also clearly not going to show it. He looked away first. "Jonah," he said, "get Miss Whitfield some water." He turned and walked inside without another word. Caleb did not speak to her at all. He watched the arrival from the porch, gave her a single nod as she passed, and disappeared into the barn. Clara noted this the way her father had taught her to note things, without visible reaction. Filed away for later consideration. Jonah showed her the house, clean but spare, the kind of clean that comes from discipline, not from care. 3 men had been living here, and it showed in the absence of softness. No curtains, no flowers, no color. Everything functional, everything working, nothing inviting you to stay. Her room was in the back, small, narrow-bed washstand window looking out onto the 3 peaks. Someone had placed a folded quilt on the bed that did not match anything else in the house, and she suspected Jonah had done this, and the gesture threatened to undo her composure more than anything since she arrived. The children appeared at supper time. Ezra came in first. Careful, watchful, 10 years old with the particular walk of a child who has learned to read rooms before entering them. He looked at Clara with large, dark brown eyes that took in everything and gave nothing back. He sat down at the table without speaking. Rosie came in second, and Rosie was Rosie. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at Clara. She looked at Clara's dress. She looked at Clara's hair. She looked at Clara's brooch. And she said, "Are you the lady from the letter Uncle Jonah said you were coming? He said you were nice. Are you nice? Do you know how to braid hair?" Because nobody here knows how to braid hair, and I have asked, and Uncle Caleb tried once, and it looked like a bird's nest, and Uncle Jonah laughed so hard he fell off the porch. Clara looked at the girl. 8 years old, red gold highlights and light brown hair, green eyes startlingly direct. "I know how to braid hair," Clara said. "Good." The word came out with the absolute finality of a child who has resolved an existential crisis. "Can you do mine after supper? If your father says it is all right." Rosie looked at Silas, who was sitting at the head of the table staring at his plate. "Papa, can the lady braid my hair after supper?" A beat. Then, "Her name is Miss Whitfield." "Can Miss Whitfield braid my hair after supper?" "Yes." Rosie nodded satisfied and climbed into her chair. Supper was quiet. Silas ate without looking up. Caleb ate with his eyes on Clara, measuring testing, waiting for something to confirm what he had already decided. Jonah tried to keep conversation alive through sheer persistence. Ezra ate carefully and watched Clara the way he watched everything, with the controlled attention of a boy who had decided that understanding was a form of safety. After supper, Clara braided Rosie's hair. She sat on the floor of the main room, and Rosie sat between her knees chattering about every animal on the ranch by name. It's about the wildflowers she picked last Tuesday that were dead now, but she was keeping them because they were still pretty, in a different way about the fact that Uncle Jonah told her stars are actually giant balls of fire, and she was not entirely convinced because they did not look like fire at all. Clara braided carefully. She had not touched the child's hair since she was a child herself, and the intimacy of it, the small warm weight of a girl who trusted her enough to sit still and talk, landed in a place she had not thought to guard. From the kitchen doorway, invisible to Clara, but not to us, Silas stood and watched. He watched Clara's hands moving through his daughter's hair. He watched Rosie's face, the particular expression of a child receiving something she had wanted for so long, she had stopped knowing she was wanting it. And something happened in Silas Hawthorne's chest that he recognized immediately and refused instantly. A crack in a wall he spent 8 years building. He turned away, he went outside. He pressed the locket against his palm in the dark. From the porch, Caleb's voice came out of the shadows. "She is playing a part. They always play a part in the beginning." "Nobody asked your opinion," Silas said. "Nobody ever does. Does not change the fact that she has been here 4 hours, and your daughter is already calling her the lady from the letter like she stepped out of a fairy story." "She braided her hair, Caleb. That is all." "That is never all. Not with an 8-year-old who has never had a mother." Silas said nothing. Caleb said nothing more. They stood in the dark together, the way they had stood 1,000 times, two men who had survived the same violence and endured the same loss and built different prisons from the wreckage, and neither of them acknowledged what they both already knew. Something shifted tonight. It was not going to shift back. Clara's first week on the Hawthorne Ranch was the hardest week of her life. Not because anyone was cruel, though Caleb came close, but because the physical reality of frontier living was nothing like she had imagined, and because earning her place in this house required a different kind of courage than the kind she had packed in her trunk. She burned the first meal she cooked, not slightly, catastrophically. The biscuits were black. The stew was somehow both overcooked and raw. The coffee was undrinkable. She stood at the stove in the aftermath with her cheeks burning and her eyes stinging, and she would not cry. She would not cry. She would absolutely not cry in front of these men. Caleb took one bite of a biscuit, set it down, and said with perfect composure, "Did you use gunpowder instead of flour, or was there a fire I missed?" The silence that followed was total. Then Jonah said, "Caleb, shut your mouth," with a heat that surprised everyone, including Caleb. Clara looked at Caleb. She held his gaze. "I have never cooked on a wood stove before," she said. Her voice was steady. "I will learn. You had better learn fast. We do not keep people who cannot pull their weight." Caleb, Silas, one word, flat, final. The kind of word that closes a conversation the way a door closes, with the weight of authority behind it. Caleb looked at his brother, then pushed back from the table and walked out. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to the stove. "I will make another batch," she said to no one in particular, and to everyone. She did. They were not good, but they were not black, and the next morning they were better. And the morning after that, better still. She learned. That was the thing Silas began to notice in the first week against his will. She learned. Not with false cheerfulness, not with the performance of effort that some people confuse with effort itself, but with the quiet, relentless determination of someone who has been underestimated her whole life and has decided that competence is the only answer she needs. She learned the wood stove. She learned the garden. She learned which hen was a good layer and which one was a fraud. She learned to haul water badly at first, sloshing more than she carried, and she learned the paths from the house to the well to the garden to the barn. She learned the children. Rosie was easy. Rosie was an open door waiting for someone to walk through it. By the third day, Rosie had decided that Clara was the most important person in the history of the world, and she followed her everywhere, narrating existence at a volume that startled the chickens. Ezra was harder. He watched. He did not speak to her directly for 3 days. On the fourth day, she was in the garden, pulling weeds, and he appeared beside her without a sound. "My mother planted these tomatoes," he said. Clara went very still. "Did she?" "My father keeps them going every year. He does not talk about it, but he does it. Uncle Jonah says it is because she grew the best tomatoes anyone ever saw." Clara pulled another weed. She did not look at the boy. She had learned enough in 4 days to know that Ezra spoke more freely when you did not look directly at him. "Do you remember her?" she asked softly. "No, ma'am. I was too young." A pause. "But I remember what she smelled like. Sort of like lavender and sort of like bread. Rosie does not even remember that." Clara's throat tightened. "My mother died when I was very small too," she said. "I remember her voice just a little. Singing." Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You will not leave, will you?" "Rosie thinks you might leave." The question was direct and without protection, the way children ask questions before they learn that vulnerability is something adults punish. "I am not planning to leave," Clara said carefully, because she would not make a promise she was not certain she could keep, and because this boy deserved honesty more than comfort. "All right," Ezra said. He pulled a weed, then another. They worked the garden together in silence, and something in the shape of the silence changed, became less empty and more full, and neither of them mentioned it. 6 days after Clara arrived, Silas rode out to check the east fence line and found 4 posts on the boundary had rotted through. He mentioned it at supper only because Jonah asked about his day. "East fence is down, 4 posts. I will deal with it tomorrow." "I can help," Clara said. Everyone looked at her. "With the fence, I can hand you tools. I can hold things. I may not know frontier cooking, but I know how to be useful." Caleb made a sound that might have been a scoff. Silas looked at her the second time he had looked at her directly since she arrived and said, "It is hard work." "I am not afraid of hard work. You have never done a day of it in your life." The words landed harder than he intended. He saw it on her face. A brief, controlled flash of something that was not hurt exactly but was close to it. "You do not know what I have done," she said quietly. And there was a quality in her voice, a thread of steel under the softness that silenced the table. The next morning she was up before dawn. She was standing outside when Silas came out with his tools, dressed in one of Meg's old work shirts that Jonah must have found, for her sleeves rolled to the elbows. Hair tied back, simply her face set with the expression of someone who was going to prove a point if it killed her. Silas said nothing. He loaded the wagon. She climbed up without being invited. They rode to the fence line in silence. The first time they had been alone together, and the weight of it filled the wagon like a physical thing. She did not try to fill it with conversation. She sat beside him and watched the mountains, in the morning light on the grass, and the hawks circling overhead. And she was quiet in a way this had Silas found against his will, against his practice, against every wall he had built unexpectedly comfortable. He worked, she helped. She was not strong. Her arms shook, lifting the posts, and her hands blistered within the first hour. But she did not complain, and she did not stop. And when he told her to hold the post steady while he drove the nail, she held it with both hands, and her teeth clenched, and her whole body braced against the weight. Ezra came running down from the house mid-morning, having begged Jonah to let him go. He stood at a careful distance and watched Silas work. "You want to learn?" Silas said. Not an offer dressed in enthusiasm, just a question. "Yes, sir." Silas held out the hammer. Ezra took it with both hands, careful and serious, as if it were something ceremonial. Clara stepped back to give them room. Silas guided the boy's hands, pointing, adjusting the angle with a word never touching. Ezra's first strike hit the nail crooked. His second was better. His third sank it clean. The boy's face opened in a way that Clara was not prepared for. Not just pride, surprise. The surprise of a child discovering that he was capable of something he did not know he could do. And underneath it, something quieter, something that looked a great deal like relief. Clara watched this from 3 steps away, and something happened in her chest that she had not braced for. She saw a man who claimed he could not connecting. She saw a boy who had been waiting for this exact moment. She saw a hammer and a nail and a fence post, and underneath all of it, the fragile, extraordinary architecture of a man teaching his son something he did not know he was ready to teach. She looked away before anyone could see what was on her face. That night, Silas stood on the porch with the locket in his palm. Jonah came out and stood beside him and said nothing for a while, then said, "She held that post all morning. Her hands are raw." "I know. You could have told her to stop." "She would not have." A pause. "No," Jonah said. "She would not have." Another pause. "She is not what you expected." "I did not expect anything." Jonah looked at him with the particular patience of a younger brother who has watched his eldest brother lie to himself for 8 years and has decided to let him do it one more time. "Right," he said, and went inside. Caleb tested Clara on the 8th day, and he did it deliberately. He was at the kitchen table when she came in to start breakfast, and he said without preamble, "Why are you here?" Clara set the coffee pot on the stove. "You know why I am here." "I know why the advertisement said you are here. I am asking why you are really here." She turned and looked at him. Caleb Hawthorne was intimidating in a different way from his brothers. Not through silence like Silas or warmth like Jonah, but through a directness that felt like being studied under glass. "I am here because I answered an advertisement," she said. "That is what you did, not why." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from him, which he did not expect. "I am here because I had no family worth the name," she said. "I am here because the only future waiting for me in Boston was marriage to a man who was 53 years old and had already buried 2 wives and looked at me like I was furniture he was considering purchasing." She held Caleb's gaze. "I am here because your brother's letter was the first thing in my life that sounded like someone was asking me to be a person instead of a transaction." Caleb was quiet. "And I am here because there are 2 children in this house who need someone," she said, "and I know what it feels like to be a child who needs someone and does not have them." She stood up. She went back to the stove. She started making coffee and did not look at him again. Caleb sat at that table for a long time after she finished speaking. Something had landed in him in a place he guarded carefully, and he was trying to decide what to do with it. He did not apologize. He was not that kind of man. But that evening, for the first time, he brought his plate to the sink after supper instead of leaving it on the table. And when Clara said thank you, he gave her a single nod, brief, almost invisible, and walked out. It was not acceptance. Not yet. But it was the first crack in a wall that had been standing since the morning she arrived. 3 weeks in. Clara had found her footing. She could cook not brilliantly, but competently and improving every day. She had learned the rhythms of the ranch. Up before dawn, breakfast for 5, sometimes 6. When Caleb did not eat it in the barn, tend the garden that Meg had planted, laundry at the creek, watched the children in the afternoons, and read to them at night from one of 3 books she had brought from Boston. Rosie had started calling her Miss Clara instead of the lady from the letter. Ezra asked questions now, not many but real ones. Jonah treated her like a friend he had known for years. Caleb treated her like a stranger he had decided not to actively oppose. Silas treated her like a piece of furniture he was trying very hard not to notice. She found the locket on a Tuesday morning. Not the one Silas carried. He never took that off. A second one, smaller, tarnished at the bottom of a kitchen drawer she was reorganizing. She opened it and found a miniature portrait of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes and a laughing mouth. On the opposite side, an inscription, "M.H. Forever Yours." She set it on the table just as Silas came in for coffee. He saw it. He went very still. The kind of still that is not calm but is the complete absence of anything to hold on to. "Where did you find that?" His voice was flat. "In the kitchen drawer. The bottom one, I was organizing." He picked it up. He held it in his palm the way he held the other one, pressed hard, white-knuckled. "That was her mother's," he said. "Meg's mother gave it to her on their wedding day. She kept it in that drawer because she said the one I gave her was enough to carry." Clara watched his face. She saw the wall behind his eyes. She saw the effort it took to hold it in place. And she saw for the first time how much that effort cost him. "My father died of consumption," she said quietly. She had not planned to say it. It arrived the way truth sometimes arrives, without permission at exactly the moment it is needed. "I was 15. I sat beside his bed and read to him for 9 days. On the last day he could not hear me anymore, but I kept reading because I thought if I stopped, he would think he was alone." Silas was very still. "I know what it is like," she said, "to hold something that belonged to someone you lost and feel like if you let go of it, you are letting go of them." She met his eyes, and for the first time he did not look away. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. Full of two kinds of grief that were different in their details and identical in their weight. Full of the particular recognition that happens when someone says the truest thing they know, and the person hearing it understands it at the level of bone. "Her name was Margaret," Silas said. "Everyone called her Meg." "Tell me about her." It was the first time anyone had said that to him. Not, "I am sorry for your loss." Not the careful avoidance of her name. Not the subject change. "Just tell me." He told her about the tomatoes, about the laugh, about the way she read to the children every night with voices for every character, about the way she looked at him when she was trying not to smile and failing, about the Elk Creek massacre, riding out with Caleb that morning to check the south pasture, hearing the gunshots from a mile away, riding back so hard the horse nearly foundered, and finding her in the root cellar alive, Jonah 15 years old and shaking behind her, both of them whole. She lived. That night she lived. Then he told the harder part. 6 years after the massacre, Meg gave birth to Rosie. A difficult birth. Fever came 3 days later. And for 11 days, Silas sat beside his wife's bed. Every morning he would look at her and she would be a little further away. Not gone, but going. Like watching someone walk into fog. You can still see them. Then you can see their shape. Then you can see the idea of them. Then there is just the fog. He held her hand every hour of those 11 days. He told her things he should have said years before. And on the last morning she looked at him and said, "Mind the children," and closed her eyes and the fog took her, and the room was just a room. He said all of this in the same flat controlled voice he used for everything, and his hands shook the entire time. Clara did not touch him. She did not try to comfort him with words. She sat across from him and she listened with her whole body, and she let the grief fill the room the way water fills a vessel. Completely. Without apology. Until there was no space left that had not been touched by it. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He looked at the tarnished locket in his hand. Then he set it on the table gently, carefully, the way you put down something you have been holding too tightly for too long. "I should get to work," he said. She nodded. He stood. He walked to the door. He stopped. "She would have liked you," he said without turning around. "She liked people who did not pretend." He walked out. The screen door closed behind him. Clara sat at the table with two lockets before her, one tarnished and one absent, and her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, and she understood with a clarity that was both illuminating and terrifying that she was not simply a mail-order bride in a house that needed a woman. She was a person who had found in the most unlikely place she could have imagined something that felt like the first honest thing in her entire life. From outside came the sound of Silas's boots on the porch steps, steady and deliberate and moving away. But not as far away as yesterday, not as far away as the day before. Something was opening, and neither of them was ready for it, and neither of them could stop it. A door that had been sealed for 8 years pushed wider by 1 inch, and the light was beginning to come in. 4 weeks in the Hawthorne Ranch had changed in ways that no one would acknowledge out loud, but everyone could feel. The house was different, not in structure. The walls were the same, the rooms were the same, the roof still leaked in the northwest corner when the rain came hard from the peaks. But the texture of the place had shifted. There were curtains now, simple muslin, sewn by Clara from fabric she bought in town with egg money earned at Opal Finch's general store. They were nothing fancy, but they changed the quality of light in the main room from institutional to something approaching warm. There were wildflowers on the kitchen table. Rosie picked them every morning. Clara put them in a jar. Neither of them discussed this arrangement because it had become as natural and as necessary as breathing. The meals were better, not just edible, but good. Clara had mastered the wood stove with the same quiet relentlessness she brought to everything, and she had discovered something unexpected about herself in the process. She enjoyed it, the transformation of raw things into something nourishing. The particular satisfaction of setting a plate in front of a man who had been eating his own cooking for 8 years and watching the surprise he tried to hide when the food was actually worth eating. Silas had started taking seconds without being asked. Caleb had stopped eating in the barn. The children were different. Ezra still watched, still measured, but there was something looser in the way he moved through the house now. He talked more. He asked Clara questions about Boston, about books, about the world beyond the mountains, and she answered with the full honest weight of what she knew, because he asked with real attention, and real attention deserved real answers. Rosie had attached herself to Clara with the ferocity of a small creature that has found its person and will not be separated under any circumstances. She followed Clara from room to room, from garden to creek to barn, narrating the world at a volume that could be heard from the south pasture on a quiet day. On a Tuesday evening, 4 weeks after Clara's arrival, something happened that changed the shape of everything. She was woken at 2 in the morning by screaming. Not the kind of scream that comes from a nightmare you can laugh about in daylight. The kind that comes from deep inside a child's body, from the place where the worst things are stored, where loss lives not as memory, but as sensation. The raw sound of a boy whose body remembers an absence his mind is too young to name. Clara was out of bed before she was fully awake. She moved through the dark house in her nightgown toward the sound, and she found Ezra sitting up in his bed, eyes wide open but seeing nothing in this room. He was somewhere else. Somewhere deep inside where the fear of losing people lived not as specific images, but as feeling. The emptiness. The presence that becomes absence. The darkness in a room where someone should be but is not. She did not hesitate. She sat on the edge of his bed and put her arms around him and held him the way she had held her father's hand in the dark. Firmly. Completely. Without asking what he was seeing, because it did not matter what he was seeing. What mattered was that he knew someone was here. He shook. He shook so hard her teeth rattled. And then very slowly the shaking subsided and he came back to himself and he realized who was holding him. And for one terrible moment she felt him begin to pull away. The instinct of a boy who had been the man of his world since he was too young to carry the weight. And then something broke in him and he let himself be held. They sat like that for a long time. From the hallway a floorboard creaked. Silas was standing in the doorway. He had been standing there since the scream. He was watching Clara hold his son, and his face was doing something she had never seen before. Something raw and exposed and full of a particular kind of pain that she had to look away from. Their eyes met over Ezra's head. In that look was everything. 8 years of a man trying to protect his children from a grief he could not shield them from. The helpless fury of a father who cannot make the nightmare stop. And the staggering, humbling realization that this woman, this stranger from Boston, who burned her first meal and could not lift a fence post, had just done in 60 seconds what he had been failing to do for 8 years. She held his son, and his son let her. Silas turned away. He walked down the hall. Clara heard the front door open and close, his boots on the porch. Then nothing. She stayed with Ezra until he fell asleep. She tucked the blanket around him and smoothed his hair and noticed that his face in sleep looked younger. Closer to the age he actually was, further from the age he had been pretending to be. In the morning, Silas said nothing about what had happened. But when Clara came to the kitchen, there was a cup of coffee already poured sitting at her place at the table, strong the way she had come to like it. She looked at the cup. She looked at Silas, who was very deliberately not looking at her. She sat down and drank it and said nothing because some things do not need words. The next afternoon, Clara was washing clothes at the creek when she heard voices carrying across the water. Jonah and Ezra on the far bank. She did not mean to listen, but sound moves on water, and by the time she realized the conversation was private, it was too late to stop hearing. They were fishing. Jonah sat on a large flat rock, legs stretched out, hat pushed back. Ezra sat beside him, rod in hand, serious as always. "Uncle Jonah," Ezra said, "do you remember my mother?" Jonah was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that belongs to a man choosing between the easy truth and the hard one. "I do," Jonah said. "I was 21 when your mother passed. I remember a great deal." "What do you remember?" "I remember her voice. She used to sing when she cooked. Not real songs. She made up the words about whatever she was doing. Something like, 'I am cutting potatoes, lovely potatoes, good potatoes,' that sort of thing. Uncle Caleb hated it, but I think he misses it too." Ezra was quiet then. "Miss Clara sings when she washes dishes." Jonah looked at his nephew. "Does she?" "Not loud, quiet. I do not think she knows I hear." Silence. The creek ran. Fish did not bite. Nobody cared. "Uncle Jonah," Ezra said, "last night Miss Clara held me." "I know, your father told me." "My father was at the door. I saw him. His face was—" Ezra stopped. He was 10 years old and trying to find words for something that did not have any yet. His face looked like he was hurting, but not from being hurt. Jonah set down his rod. He looked at his nephew. Really looked. Not sideways or quick, but the way he looked when he decided a child deserved to be treated like an adult. "Your father loves you," Jonah said, "and your father loved your mother. And for 8 years your father has believed those two things could not exist in the same place as anything else. He has believed that letting someone in means your mother gets replaced." "Miss Clara is not replacing my mother," Ezra said quickly. "No, she is not. But she can exist alongside, like when you build an extra room onto a house. The old room is still there. You do not tear down the old room to build a new one. You just make the house bigger." Ezra thought about this for a very long time. He had his father's way of thinking. Slow, thorough, examining every angle before arriving at a conclusion. "Do you think my father knows that?" Ezra asked. "I think your father is learning." "Who is teaching him?" Jonah looked at his nephew and the crooked smile, the real one, not the one he used for socializing, appeared. "You are," he said, "and your sister, and Miss Clara, and maybe your Uncle Caleb and me, though I think our part is smaller than the rest." Ezra looked at the creek. "I want her to stay," he said quietly. "So do I, Ez. So do I." They fished for another hour. Nobody caught anything, nobody cared. Clara on the far bank washed very slowly and very quietly, and did not wipe her eyes because her hands were wet. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that the water on her cheeks was not all from the creek. Later that week, Clara was cleaning the small storage room she had been turning into a schoolroom for the children. At the bottom of an old trunk, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She recognized the handwriting on the first envelope. She recognized it because she grew up with it. She learned to read from it, her father's handwriting, Edward Whitfield. The letters were addressed to Mrs. Margaret Hawthorne, Hawthorne Ranch, Elk Hollow, Montana Territory. Her hands began to shake. She read them. Correspondence between her father, a schoolteacher in Boston, and Meg Hawthorne, who had been a teacher herself before moving west. They wrote about education, about books, about the challenges of teaching children in different worlds. The letters spanned years from before the Elk Creek Massacre through the years after, when Meg was still alive and still writing, even with 2 small children and a ranch to run. The final letter was dated 6 months before Meg died, when she was carrying Rosie. Her father wrote, "If you ever need anything, Margaret, you and your family are always welcome in Boston. There is room in this world for people who believe that education is the bridge between where we are and where we could be." Clara sat on the floor of the storage room holding her father's letters and understood with a slow, dawning recognition that felt like vertigo that her arrival at this ranch was not purely random. She had answered an advertisement from a place where her father had already sent part of himself. The letters had been here for years, waiting. She brought them to Silas that evening. He read them at the kitchen table. His face did not change, but his hands did. They went very still on the paper, the way they went still when something had reached a part of him he thought was sealed. She never told me, Ibwai, he said at last. She wrote to a lot of people. She was like that. She collected people the way others collect books. My father was like that too. Silence. Then Silas looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the guarded distance, not the careful neutrality, something closer to wonder. Your father sent his words to my wife, he said slowly, and 8 years later his daughter walked through my door. I did not know, Clara said. When I answered the advertisement, I did not know. I believe you. A longer silence, fuller than the first. Do you believe in providence? He asked. It was the kind of question he would never have asked a week ago. I believe, she said, that some things happen for reasons we cannot see until we are standing inside them. He looked at the letters. He looked at her. He set the letters down on the table between them and said, keep them. They belong to you more than to me. They belong to both of us, she said. The threat came on a morning so ordinary that the contrast with what followed made it feel like a hallucination. Clara was in the garden. Rosie was helping pick tomatoes from the plants that Meg had put in the ground plants that Silas had kept alive for 8 years without ever explaining why. Rosie was singing a song she had invented about a tomato that wanted to be a flower instead, and the sun was warm, and the sky was enormous, and everything felt for one perfect, suspended moment like it might actually be all right. Then a rider came up the road, alone, moving slowly, the way a man rides when he wants you to see him coming and have time to consider what that means. He had a flat face and flat eyes and the kind of expression that has been stripped of everything that makes a face human. Clara straightened from the garden. Rosie went quiet. The man stopped his horse at the gate. He looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He looked at Clara. He looked at Rosie. Morning, ma'am, he said. Can I help you? Just passing through. Nice spread you got here. He looked at the mountains. Nice land for folks living so far from town. Long way for help to come if something went wrong. Clara felt cold settle through her despite the heat. She placed her hand on Rosie's shoulder. Accidents happen in the mountains, the man said. He tipped his hat. You folks be careful. He looked at Rosie one more time, deliberately, pacifically, in a way designed not to see the child, but to communicate that the child had been seen, that she was countable, that she could be reached. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road. Clara stood in the garden with her hand on Rosie's shoulder and her heart slamming against her ribs and her face showing nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because there was a child beside her and the child could not know what had just happened. Rosie, she said, and her voice was perfect, perfectly controlled. Go inside and find Uncle Jonah. Tell him I need him. Are you all right, Miss Clara? I am fine, sweetheart. Go inside. Rosie went. Clara stood alone in the garden, and her hands began to shake, and she let them shake because nobody was watching, and she needed 30 seconds of honest terror before putting the mask back on. She got 20. Then Jonah was there, and she told him, and his face changed. The easy warmth drained away, replaced by something harder and older that told her the youngest Hawthorne brother was not just the charming one. That evening, after the children were asleep, the 4 adults sat at the kitchen table, and Clara described the man and his words exactly as they had happened. She described the way he looked at Rosie. She described it without embellishment and without tears, because this was not a time for either. Silas's face during her account was something Clara filed away and would never forget. Not anger, or rather anger was in it, but underneath the anger was something colder and more focused. The face of a man who has just been told that someone looked at his daughter with intent and who is making calculations that have nothing to do with law and everything to do with the elemental mathematics of protection. Dane, Caleb said flatly. Victor Dane. He has been buying land along the railroad corridor for 2 years. We got a letter 6 months ago before you came. He looked at Clara. A letter claiming our cousin Marcus sold mineral rights on our land to a third party. The claim is fraudulent. Marcus never had rights to sell. Why did nobody tell me? Clara said. The 3 brothers exchanged a look. Because it was not your fight, Silas said. I live here. I cook for your children. I hold your son when he has nightmares. Her voice was quiet and absolute. It became my fight the moment I walked through that door. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges a room. Caleb looked at her. really looked perhaps for the first time, and something shifted in his expression. Not all the way to respect, but in the direction of it. She is right, Caleb said, and it cost him something to say it, and everyone at the table knew. The next morning, Silas Hawthorne did something he had not done in 8 years. He asked people for help. He rode into Elk Hollow with copies of every document. The deed, the authentication, Dane's fraudulent letters, Clara's written account of the man who came to the ranch. Sheriff Grady Walsh read through the papers slowly, methodically. "You know who Victor Dane is," Walsh said. "I know who he is." "Then you know putting his name on record in my county is going to draw his attention." "Good. I want his attention on me." Walsh studied him. "Silas, I have known you 12 years. In 12 years, you have walked into this office exactly once when the Harker brothers jumped your south fence 9 years back." He leaned back. "You are telling me you are willing to put yourself in Victor Dane's crosshairs. I am telling you that I have 2 children and a woman under my roof and a clean deed to my land, and a violent man is trying to take all of it. I want the law in this county standing on the right side before he arrives." Walsh held his gaze. Then he picked up his pen. Silas went to old Emmett Burke next, who sat in his chair outside the barber shop and looked startled when Silas pulled up a seat beside him. Startled because Silas Hawthorne had not voluntarily sat beside another human being in public for nearly a decade. He told Emmett plainly what was happening. Emmett's face changed from surprise to attention to something harder. "I knew your father," Emmett said. "Knew him when he first brought you boys up to those 3 peaks. Good man. Built something real." He was quiet a moment. "You have got a woman up there now, and those children, and you are telling me some speculator is threatening them. That is what I am telling you. What do you need?" "I need people in this town to know her name. Clara Whitfield. She is part of this family now, and she is not alone." Then Harlan Prescott, the largest landowner in the valley, harder to convince, his own property to protect his own reasons for avoiding conflict. But when Silas explained the railroad corridor and what Dane's acquisition would mean for every property along it, including Prescott's, the man's eyes sharpened. "If Dane gets your land and the railroad comes through, he controls the corridor," Prescott said slowly. "Every other property loses negotiating power, including yours." Prescott picked up the documents. "Leave me copies. I will make some calls." Last was Opal Finch at the general store. Opal did not need convincing. She listened and said, "That girl has been coming into my store every week for a month. She calculates every penny, and she asks about my children's schoolwork. And she is the first person in this town who has made your Rosie laugh in public." She looked at Silas with the direct gaze of a woman who has been running the information center of Elk Hollow for 15 years. "I will make sure every person who walks through that door bar knows her name." Silas stood on the boardwalk in the noon heat and looked at what he had done. In 12 years of living in this county, he had never asked a single person for a single thing. He asked for today, and he did not hesitate for 1 second. The fire came at 3 in the morning, 5 days after Silas went to see Walsh. Jonah smelled the smoke first. He slept light, a habit born from the night of the Elk Creek massacre 14 years earlier, when he was 15 and learned that the world could change without warning. He shouted the alarm, and by the time he reached the yard, the hay barn on the south side, the one that held enough feed to carry the cattle through winter, was already blazing. The 3 brothers charged out. Clara came after them. The children were told to stay inside, and this was one of the first moments Ezra showed who he truly was. He did not cry. He did not shout. He took his sister's hand, led her to the back room, closed the door and sat in the middle of the floor, with her back straight, eyes dry, ready if the fire reached the house. 10 years old, behaving like a man. The cost of that was something nobody calculated. Outside, the fire was a living thing. It did not burn, it ate. 3 months of summer dried Montana hay was perfect fuel, and the flames consumed it at a speed that told Silas within the first 10 seconds that the hay barn was gone. The only question was the main barn 30 paces away. 30 paces in a night wind. They fought for 2 hours, not to save the hay, to keep the fire from spreading. Clara hauled water from the well, every bucket 40 pounds, with bare hands, because there was no time to find gloves. The 5th time her grip slipped on the wooden handle. The 10th time blisters rose. The 15th time, the blisters broke. The 20th time, she could no longer feel her palms, and that actually helped her pull faster. Jonah threw buckets at the east face of the main barn, where the wood had begun to smoke, though it had not yet caught. Caleb and Silas beat flying embers with soaked blankets, two enormous soot-blackened figures, moving through the firelight like industrial ghosts. Silas did not speak a single word in 2 hours. He only worked, and the silent efficiency of him was the thing that kept everyone focused. Because if Silas Hawthorne was still moving, it was not yet time to panic. The wind shifted at 4:47 in the morning, turned west instead of north, away from the barn, and everyone breathed, not with relief. It was too early for relief, but the kind of breathing that means still alive. When dawn came, the hay barn was nothing but a blackened frame. The smell of burned grass would hang over the ranch for weeks. 6 tons of hay, 3 months of cutting and drying and stacking. The work of 4 people, gone in 2 hours. Silas stood in the ashes, face black with soot, and surveyed the damage with the eyes of a man who had calculated everything in his life by numbers. 6 tons of hay, 30 head of cattle, 1 Montana winter. The arithmetic required no special skill. Without hay, the cattle would be dead before Christmas. Caleb found hoof prints at the edge of the property. 4 sets. Coming from the south, going south. Beside the prints, a broken kerosene bottle. Not an accident. Deliberate arson. Dane, Caleb said flatly. Dane, Silas confirmed. Clara stood beside them, her bleeding hands wrapped in cloth torn from her dress, her face black with soot, her blonde hair gray with ash, and she looked at the ruins and understood with brutal clarity that this was no longer a threat. This was war, and it had started. Rosie stood in the doorway of the house, face-white, Ezra behind her, standing guard over his sister, and the girl said in a small voice, "Papa, the hay barn for the cows is gone." Silas looked at his daughter. He looked at his son, standing behind her with a grown man's posture. He looked at the ashes. He looked at Clara with her bleeding hands. He looked at his brothers, exhausted, covered in soot, still standing. "It will be rebuilt," he said, and his voice had the quality of steel. Not a promise, a fact. The loss of the hay was a blow aimed directly at survival. The arithmetic was simple to the point of cruelty. No winter feed, the cattle die. No cattle, the ranch dies. Sell the land in autumn at a fraction of its value, or starve through winter. Those were the two choices Dane intended to leave. He did not need lawyers. He needed 1 bottle of kerosene and patience. But Dane miscalculated one thing. He assumed the Hawthorns were isolated, that 8 years of Silas's silence meant no one would come. News of the fire spread through Elk Hollow in 2 days. Opal Finch made certain of that, telling every person who walked through her door with exact detail, and the measured outrage of a woman who had lived on the frontier long enough to know when cruelty had crossed a line. And what happened next was the thing Silas Hawthorne did not expect, because he had stopped expecting anything from people outside his family a very long time ago. Emmett Burke arrived first, 72 years old, driving a hay wagon 5 miles of mountain road alone before dawn. 2 tons from his own reserves. "Your father helped me roof my barn winter before you were born," the old man said when Silas came out to meet him. "I have not finished repaying." Silas looked at the old man, looked at the hay. He opened his mouth and closed it. He did not have words for this. He had not had words for kindness in 8 years. "Thank you," he said, 2 words that sounded like they had been stored somewhere deep and were only now being brought into daylight for the first time in years. Emmett heard them and nodded and said nothing more because he understood. Harlan Prescott sent 3 tons the next day. "Not charity, investment," he said plainly. "If Dane breaks you, I am next in line. The railroad does not stop at your property." 3 other families in the valley brought more. By the end of the week, the new hay supply, not yet in a barn, but covered with heavy tarp and lashed down tight, held more than what had been lost. Silas stood among the hay bales and looked at the neighbors he had not spoken to in 8 years, and something in him broke. Not the wall he had built, the certainty that the wall was necessary. He had lived 8 years believing he needed no one, and they came anyway. Clara stood beside him, her hands still bandaged. He looked down at her hands. You should have Jonah look at those again, he said. My hands are fine. Your hands are bleeding through the bandage. Then I need a new bandage, not a chair. He looked at her for a long time. And then the thing that nobody on this ranch had seen in 8 years, one corner of his mouth turned upward. Not a smile. Close. The closest Silas Hawthorne had come in a decade. You are stubborn, he said. You say that like it is news, she said, then. The night after the fire, Caleb stood watch on the porch. Clara brought 2 cups of coffee out, set one beside him without asking whether he wanted it, and sat in the other chair. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. Then Caleb said without looking at her, You did not run. Pardon, last night the barn burning. You did not run inside and hide. You hauled water until your hands split open. It is my home that was burning. Caleb turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her without suspicion, without evaluation, without the lens of distrust he had been wearing since the day she arrived. I was against you coming here, he said. You know that. I know. I thought you would be chained. I thought you would last a week, maybe 2. I thought you would see how hard it was and how far from everything you knew, and you would get back on that stagecoach. And my brother would have one more reason to believe that letting someone in is the same as losing them. Clara listened without interrupting. I was wrong, Caleb said. It came out of him the way a nail comes out of old wood, with effort, with resistance, and with the small sound of something giving way. I have been wrong about you since the first day, and I have been too proud to say it. You were protecting your family. I understand that. Do not make it easy for me. I do not deserve easy. You are right. You do not. A pause. But I am not keeping score. Not with people I care about. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the coffee she had brought and drank it. And the gesture, small, ordinary, just a man drinking coffee, was its own kind of acceptance. A gate opening that had been locked since the morning she arrived. Good coffee, he said. I know. They came 11 days after the fire, 4 men armed riding from the south before dawn. But this time the Hawthorns were waiting. Silas was in the barn with his rifle before the first rider cleared the gate. Caleb was on the porch within 30 seconds, arms silent. Jonah appeared at the east barn door covering the flank. The lead rider had the same flat face and flat eyes Clara had described. Jeb Sykes. He pulled up in the yard. Mr. Hawthorne, Mr. Dane sent us for a conversation. Say what you came to say. The lady of the house is sitting on land that belongs to Mr. Dane by right of purchase. He has been patient. This land belongs to the Hawthorne family by deed registered in this county and authenticated by Judge Hartwick and Helena. The sheriff has copies. The county recorder has copies. 4 other landowners in this valley have copies. Silas's voice was even and controlled. That is the conversation. It ends there. It ends. Sykes looked at the house. The windows were dark. Then the screen door opened. Clara walked out onto the porch. She was in her day dress, hair loose, and she stood beside Caleb. Not behind him, beside him. And she looked at the 4 men with the same direct, unflinching gaze that had first unsettled Silas 5 weeks ago. I heard you, she said. You tell Mr. Dane that I have documentation from the sheriff, the county recorder, and the judge in Helena. He does not have a legal claim, and every day he keeps trying costs him more. She paused. Her voice did not shake. And you tell him that I am not alone. Then the thing happened that nobody expected. Sykes glanced to his right and signaled. One of the 4 men, fast without warning, drew his pistol and fired. Not at Clara, at the window above her head. A warning shot, an act of intimidation. But Caleb had already moved. In the fraction of a second the bullet traveled, Caleb stepped in front of Clara and turned his shoulder. The bullet grazed his left upper arm, tore through fabric, and blood came immediately. The chain reaction was instant. Silas raised his rifle. Jonah stepped forward with 2 revolvers. The sound of metal on metal yet filled the yard. The next man who draws, Silas said, his voice no louder than normal, but carrying the weight of a man who would do exactly what he said, does not ride home. Sykes assessed the situation. 3 Hawthorne men, unarmed, all not bluffing. The arithmetic did not favor him. We are leaving, Sykes had said to his men. They turned their horses. They rode out. Caleb sat down on the porch step. Blood ran through his fingers where he gripped the wound. Clara was kneeling beside him, immediately tearing her own sleeve into a makeshift bandage. Caleb let me see. Just a graze, he said, but his face was white. She tied the bandage around his arm. Her hands shook, but the knots were tight. He watched her work. You know how to tie a tourniquet? He asked, genuine surprise underneath the pain. My father taught me. He said everyone should know. Your father was a smart man. My father was a teacher. Teachers prepare for everything. Caleb looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, almost to himself, You belong in this family. That was the first time Caleb Hawthorne called her part of the family. It happened while she was tying a bandage around a bullet wound on his arm at dawn, and it was worth more than any formal declaration could ever be. That afternoon, while the brothers reinforced the perimeter and the children napped, Clara went to her room. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she fell apart. Not loudly. She fell apart the way real people fall apart. Quietly, hand over her mouth so no one could hear, shoulders shaking with the effort of holding in what she could no longer hold. She thought about the bullet. She thought about Caleb stepping in front of her. She thought about how, if he had been standing 2 inches to the right, 2 inches the bullet would not have grazed his arm. It would have hit his chest. 2 inches between a graze and a death. 2 inches that Caleb Hawthorne had placed his body into because of her. She thought about Rosie at the door, face white, not understanding. About Ezra at the window, understanding too well. She shook for 7 minutes. She counted them on the small clock on the wall because counting was something she could control, and right now she needed to control something. At the 8th minute she stopped, wiped her face, stood, smoothed her dress, looked at herself in the swollen mirror above the washstand, a woman with red osses and a jaw made of iron. You are not leaving, she said to the woman in the mirror. You are not running. You did not travel 2,000 miles to be frightened away by men on horses. She went to the kitchen, made coffee. Her hands shook on the pot and she poured anyway, and the coffee was strong and good. And when Jonah came in from outside and said, You all right? She said, Getting there. Jonah looked at her with the kind of look that sees past surfaces. For what it is worth, you were the bravest person on that porch this morning. I was the most terrified person on that porch this morning. That is the same thing, Jonah said. And for the first time since she had met him, there was nothing easy or light in his voice. He sounded like his brothers. He sounded like a man who understood exactly what courage costs. Clara looked at him. You heard them that night, she said. She did not specify which night. She did not need to. The massacre. You were in the cellar. Jonah's face changed. The charm fell away like a mask removed by careful hands. Underneath was something quieter, older, more familiar with darkness than anyone who only saw his smile would ever guess. I heard everything, he said. 15 years old. Sudden, Silas told me to keep Meg safe. I lay in that cellar with my sister-in-law, and I listened to people dying outside, and I could not see any of it, which was worse somehow, because my imagination filled in every gap. He paused. Meg held my hand. She sang. Quietly so the raiders would not hear. She sang to me, a 15-year-old boy shaking like a leaf, and her voice did not waver once. She was brave, Clara said softly. So are you, Jonah said. My brother sees it. I see it. Thank you, Jonah, for writing the advertisement, for being the one who decided something had to change. I wrote a letter. You got on a train. Then we are both brave fools. He laughed, the real laugh, warm and sudden, and the weight in the room lifted just enough to breathe. 3 days later, after the immediate danger had settled into the tense waiting that is its own kind of siege, Ezra found Silas in the barn. The boy stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides. He had the walk of a child who has prepared what he is going to say and is committed to saying it. Pa. Silas looked up from the saddle he was mending. Is Miss Clara going to stay direct without apology? Not just until the trouble is over. I mean after. Is she going to stay with us? Silas set the saddle down. Because Rosie thinks she might leave. Rosie does not say it, but I know. She gets quiet when Miss Clara goes to town and she watches the road until she comes back. Ezra's voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. The jaw of a boy holding himself together with everything he had. And I do not want to get used to someone being here if they are going to go away. The courage of this, the specific, enormous, devastating courage of a child who has lost before and is asking permission to hope. Silas looked at his son. He thought about 8 years, about nightmares and braided hair and burned biscuits and a woman who held his boy in the dark when he could not. He thought about what it cost a 10-year-old who had been the man of his house since he was 8 to ask this question in broad daylight. "I am going to ask her to stay," Silas said. Ezra held his gaze for one more second. Then he nodded once with the decisive finality of someone closing a chapter. "Good, yeah," he said. He picked up a rope and walked out of the barn. Silas sat very still for a long time. He pressed the locket against his palm. But the pressure was different this time. Less urgent. Less like a man gripping a rope over a cliff, and more like a man resting his hand on a fence he built, feeling the wood, knowing it is solid, knowing it will stand, whether he leans on it or not. 2 days later, a legal filing arrived at the ranch. It was addressed in formal legal language to the Hawthorne estate and Miss Clara Whitfield, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. Clara's blood went cold. She had not told anyone in Montana her former address. She had not told anyone where she came from except the Hawthorne brothers. Dane knew who she was, specifically, individually, by name and origin. She brought the filing to the kitchen table. Silas read it. A formal challenge to the deed. Procedural theater designed to create delay rather than to win. But it was the heading that mattered. "How does he know your name?" Yella said. "I do not know." Caleb, reading over Silas's shoulder, said, "He investigated her. The moment she arrived, he had someone find out who she was, where she came from. He is not just fighting us for land. He is building a file." The implications settled over the table like cold water. "He is trying to challenge the marriage arrangement," Caleb said slowly. "If he can prove she is not a legitimate family member, that the mail order arrangement was never properly formalized, he weakens the estate claim. He is not just after the land. He is after the legal standing of everyone on it." Clara looked at Silas. Silas looked at Clara. Something passed between them that was not spoken, but was understood completely. "We need a lawyer," Silas said. "A good one," Caleb said. "From Helena, someone who knows territorial law and is not afraid of Dane's money." The conversation that followed was practical, focused, and necessary. They discussed options, cost, timeline. But underneath the logistics, underneath the strategy, something else was happening. The quiet, powerful shift of people who had stopped being individuals dealing with a shared problem and had become a family facing a threat together. And that word family was no longer something anyone at the table needed to question. 3 days after the legal filing arrived, Caleb was gone before dawn. He left a note on the kitchen table in his angular handwriting. 2 sentences. "Back in 4 days. Do not worry." The kind of note that guarantees worry by asking you not to. Silas read it and his jaw tightened. Jonah read it and said, "Where in God's name did he go?" Clara read it and said nothing, but she had a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you have been watching someone change and you recognize the shape of what they are about to do before they do it. Caleb rode 2 days to Helena. He rode through the night on the first day with a bullet wound that had not fully healed the bandage Clara had changed every morning for the past week, already spotting through with red by the time he stopped to sleep 4 hours in a roadside camp. He rode the second day straight through. He arrived in Helena exhausted, dust covered his left arm, stiff with pain he would not acknowledge, and absolutely clear about what he had come to do. He went to the office of Thaddeus Cole, attorney at law. Cole was exactly as his reputation described him: short-tempered, thorough, expensive. He had a reputation for winning cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable, and he had a personality that made most people want to leave the room within 5 minutes. He was small and sharp-faced, and he wore spectacles that he looked over rather than through, which gave the impression that he was permanently disappointed in whatever he was examining. Caleb sat in Cole's office and laid out the entire situation in 10 minutes flat. No embellishment, no emotion. The precision of a man who had been building the case in his head for weeks and was now simply transferring it from thought to speech. He showed Cole the deed, the authentication, the fraudulent claim, the legal filing, Clara's written account of Sykes's visit, his own arm still bandaged. Cole read everything. He looked up. "This is a straightforward dismissal," he said. 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. The filing has no merit. The challenge to Hartwick's authentication is procedurally baseless. Do it in 10. Well, that costs more. I know. Caleb reached into his coat and set a leather pouch on Cole's desk. It contained his savings. 4 years of wages from ranch work trading and the small investments he had made with his share of the cattle sales. It was functionally everything he owned in the world. Cole looked at the pouch. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the bandaged arm. This the family's money, mine. Your brothers know you are here. They will when I get back. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who convinced you this was worth your life savings?" Caleb thought about a woman who burned her first meal and held a fence post until her hands bled and held his nephew in the dark and looked at four armed men without flinching and tied a bandage around his arm at dawn while her own hands shook. She does not know she did it, Caleb said. That is the thing about her. She does not know what she does to people. He rode home. He arrived 4 days later as promised. He walked into the kitchen at supper time, dusty, exhausted face entirely without expression. He sat down at the table. He picked up a fork. Cole will have the motion filed by Friday, he said. Hearing in 10 days. It will be dismissed. The filing has no merit. The table was silent. You went to Helena, Silas said. Yes. You hired Thaddeus Cole? Yes. With what money? Caleb looked at his plate. Mine. The silence that followed changed the air pressure in the room. Silas was looking at his brother with an expression Clara had never seen on his face. Something that went beyond gratitude, beyond surprise, into the territory of a man who has just understood something about his own family that he missed for years. Caleb, Silas said, and his voice had a quality that made Clara's throat tighten. Don't, Caleb said. He stabbed a piece of potato. Just don't. It needed to be done. Clara was watching Caleb with bright eyes. She was fighting something behind her face. She was losing. Thank you, she said, barely above a whisper. Caleb did not look at her, but his jaw worked and he swallowed once and he said, You are family. Family does what needs doing. That single sentence spoken by the man who 5 weeks ago told her she had better learn fast because we do not keep people who cannot pull their weight was the most significant thing anyone had said to her since she arrived in Montana. Rosie, entirely unaware of the emotional complexity of the moment, said, Can I have more potatoes? Jonah laughed. It broke the tension like a window opening. Ezra looked at his uncle with those dark, serious eyes and said, Uncle Caleb, did you ride all the way to Helena by yourself? I did. That is 200 miles. I know how far it is. Your shoulder is still bleeding. Everyone looked. It was true. The bandage at Caleb's shoulder was spotted through with red. He had ridden 4 days with a wound that had not closed. Lord Caleb, Clara said, already on her feet, already reaching for clean bandages. You rode 4 days with an open wound. It is just a graze, Caleb said. The same words he had used the night he was shot. Sit still. Let me change it. He sat still. She changed the bandage. Her hands were steady, careful with the competence of a woman who had tied a field tourniquet at dawn and had not stopped being capable since. He watched her work. His eyes, the eyes that had guarded and suspected and evaluated since the day she arrived, were simply tired now. And underneath the tired, something softer. Something rare. You know, Caleb said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. I used to think my brother was out of his mind for agreeing to that advertisement. And now I think Jonah was the only sane one of the three of us. Victor Dane came himself 9 days later, 3 days before Cole's hearing date. He came at midday, bright, open, visible, with 2 men instead of 4 and wearing a good coat. He was making a show of reasonableness. All 3 Hawthorne brothers were in the yard when he rode up, Silas in the center, Caleb on his left shoulder bandaged but standing, Jonah on his right, shoulder to shoulder. 3 men built on this scale standing together was its own kind of argument. Dane pulled up his horse. He was older than Claire expected, mid-50s, thick through the chest, patient in the way of a man who had learned that most problems could be solved by simply outlasting the other person's nerve. Sharp eyes under a flat brow. He used them the way experienced negotiators do, reading everything before saying anything. Hawthorne, he said. Which one? All 3, Silas said. Say what you came to say. Dane laid out his claim, the bill of sale from Marcus, the rights he believed he had purchased, the legal standing he intended to enforce. He spoke in measured, reasonable tones, the way men speak when they believe what they are doing is simply business. Silas answered point by point. The deed, the authentication, the county records, the lawyer from Helena already filing for dismissal. Then Dane played his last card. Railroad money is significant, Hawthorne. Men in your position could use a partner on a corridor deal. I am not unreasonable. The offer hung in the air. Partnership, profit sharing. The language of cooperation draped over the skeleton of a buyout. You are offering us money to step aside, Silas said. I am offering a share of a profitable arrangement. The answer is no. The screen door opened. Clara came down the porch steps. She walked across the yard and stopped beside Silas. Not behind him, not between the brothers. Beside the eldest, in the specific position that said more than words about where she stood and what she was to this family. Mr. Dane, she said, this is Hawthorne land. 3 brothers built it, 2 children are growing up on it, and I intend to grow old on it. Her voice was even and clear. Your bill of sale is fraudulent. Your filing is baseless, and your lawyer, if you have hired one, will tell you the same thing ours has told us. She paused, one beat, deliberate. Go home. Dane looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the 3 brothers. Then he looked at the mountains rising behind the ranch. 3 peaks like 3 sentinels guarding something that would not be moved. You are making a mistake, Dane said to Silas. Would not be my first, Silas said. Dane turned his horse. His men followed. They rode out the gate and down the south road. They did not look back. The hearing hit a wall. 3 days before Cole's court date, a telegram arrived at the ranch. Silas read it at the kitchen table. His face did not change, but his hands went still in the way Clara had learned to recognize. The stillness that meant something had gone wrong. The county clerk cannot find the copies of Hartwick's authentication, he said. The documents have been removed from the county records. Silence at the table. Clara, Caleb, Jonah, all of them understanding the implications at the same speed. Someone in the clerk's office is working for Dane, Caleb said. Without the county copies, Cole needs the originals from Hartwick and Helena, Silas said. That adds 10 days, maybe more. Every day Dane delays is a day the railroad survey team might change the corridor route, Clara said. He does not need to win, he just needs to stall. They sat with this for a moment. The mathematics of attrition. Dane did not need victory in court. He needed time. And time was the one thing they could not manufacture. Someone has to go to Helena, Silas said. Get Hartwick to sign new originals with the court seal. Bring them back. I cannot leave the ranch, not with Dane circling, Silas said. Caleb just came back. His shoulder is not healed. I will go, Clara said. The silence that followed was absolute. I know, Helena, she continued. I passed through on my way here. I can read legal documents. My father taught me. And Dane is not expecting me. He is watching for you or Caleb. Silas looked at her. His face fought between the instinct to protect, to keep her here safe where he could control what happened, and the recognition that she was right, and that treating her as someone who needed protection instead of as a partner was an insult to exactly the person she had proven herself to be. Jonah goes with you, Titty said. That is not a discussion. Agreed. Clara and Jonah rode out the next morning before dawn. 2 days of trail. Jonah carried a rifle and a knife. Clara carried the documents, the depositions, and a letter of introduction from Cole for Judge Hartwick. She also carried tucked into her coat pocket, without telling anyone, her mother's cameo brooch. Not because she needed it for courage, but because if something happened on the road, she wanted her mother close. Silas stood at the gate when they left. He did not say, be careful or come back safe. He said, Jonah. And his brother looked at him, and in that look was everything. Protect her. Bring her home. Let nothing happen. And Jonah nodded once decisive and turned his horse. 2 days through pine hills and wide valleys, across shallow creeks and rocky trails, through country so vast that Clara felt for the first time the true scale of the West. Not the scale of maps, the scale of the body, the kind of distance you feel in your back and thighs, and the hands gripping the reins for 10 hours of riding each day. They slept one night on the trail beside a creek under Montana stars that nothing Clara had ever read in a Boston book prepared her for. The Milky Way was not a faint glow, it was a river, thick enough to touch. She lay in her blanket beside the small fire Jonah built, and he sat first, watch rifle across his thighs, eyes sweeping the darkness with the old habit from the root cellar. "You are not sleeping," she asked. "First shift. I wake you at 2. You take second. I can keep watch." "I know you can. If you could not, you would not be here." She slept. He woke her at 2 exactly. She sat watch with the dying fire and the sound of night insects and the strange, wonderful feeling of a person doing something important in the middle of somewhere vast for people she loved. And the word loved came into her mind for the first time without a question following it, and she let it sit there, and it fit. They reached Helena without incident. Judge Hartwick, an old man with heavy eyebrows and sharp eyes, the kind of man who had sat on the bench long enough to be impressed with nothing and no one read the documents, slowly checked the originals in the archive, cross-referenced the seals and signed new authenticated copies with the court stamp and 2 witnesses. He looked at Clara when he handed over the papers. "You rode 2 days for this?" "Yes, sir." "Alone with my brother-in-law." Hartwick studied her for a moment. Then he said something Clara would remember longer than the red seal itself. "Tell Mr. Dane that the next time he tampers with court records, I will personally sit the bench at his trial." He paused. "And tell your husband he is a fortunate man." Clara held the documents with both hands. She looked at the red seal and the signatures and understood that she was holding the future of her family. Not the family she was born into. The one she chose. The one that chose her. And the word husband that Hartwick used, though nothing had been formalized, did not make her blink. On the ride home, when the 3 peaks appeared on the horizon against an evening sky burning orange and red, Jonah watched her ride, back straight despite 2 days in the saddle, documents in the leather pouch at her hip, face focused and calm. "You know," he said, "when I wrote that advertisement and I imagined someone would come and cook meals and watch the children." "Sorry to disappoint," Clara said dryly. "You have not disappointed me. You have astonished me." A pause. "My brother is fortunate. All of us are." Clara looked at the mountains ahead, the 3 peaks growing darker and more permanent against the fading sky, and said quietly, "So am I." When they reached the ranch at dusk on the 4th day, Rosie ran to the gate screaming, "Miss Clara is back! Miss Clara is back!" and wrapped herself around Clara's waist before she could dismount. Ezra stood on the porch. He did not shout, he did not run, but his face did something that only Clara would recognize after 4 weeks of learning the Hawthorne face. He smiled, small, brief, almost invisible, but real. Silas stood beside Ezra. He watched Clara step down from the horse with Rosie attached to her waist and Jonah behind her grinning wide, and he saw the leather pouch at her hip, and he knew before she spoke. "Hartwick signed," she said. "Originals, court seal, witnesses." Silas looked at her for a long time. "Thank you," he said. And in the way he said it, slow heavy like a stone being set down, was everything he did not say. That she had ridden 4 days for his family's land. That she had slept under the stars for his deed. That she had carried back the thing that might save everything they had built. And that he had never asked. She did not say, "You are welcome." She said, "It is my home as much as it is yours." And that sentence, simple and direct and completely true, was the moment Silas Hawthorne knew, not thought, not hoped, but knew that he was going to ask this woman to stay. Not for the winter, not for the lawsuit, forever. Cole got the hearing in 12 days, not 10, slower than planned because of the record sabotage. But when it came, it was decisive. Hartwick's documentation held absolutely. The challenge was dismissed. The judge noted in his ruling that the Hawthorne deed was properly registered and that further challenges would be considered frivolous filings subject to sanctions. But the thing no one expected came from Cole's investigation into Dane's bill of sale. Marcus Hawthorne, Silas's distant cousin, the man who had allegedly sold the rights, was not dead as everyone assumed. He was alive, living in Oregon Territory, and he was willing to testify under oath that the sale was made under duress. That Dane's men had threatened his family, held his wife in their home for 3 days, forced him to sign documents he knew were fraudulent. This was not just a victory for the Hawthornes. It was the beginning of the end for Victor Dane's entire operation in Montana. 5 other families came forward with similar stories: forged deeds, forced sales, threats against wives and children. The territorial marshal got involved. Within a month, Dane was under formal federal investigation. Dane himself disappeared from the territory. Not running, the kind of man like Dane never runs. He simply relocates to easier targets. But for the Hawthorns, the immediate threat was finished. And that was enough. Sheriff Walsh brought the ruling to the ranch in person. He stood on the porch and shook Silas's hand, the second time in 12 years of acquaintance that the sheriff had come to the house. "It is done," Walsh said. He looked at Clara, at the children, at the three brothers standing together, Silas in the center, Caleb on the left with his healed shoulder, Jonah on the right with his easy grin, and Clara beside Silas, her hand near his, but not touching the small distance both of them still kept, because there were things they had not yet said aloud. "Your father would be proud," Walsh said. "All of you." He looked at Clara for one extra second. "Meg, too," he said quietly. Then he tipped his hat and rode away. Silas stood on the porch long after Walsh's figure disappeared down the road. The locket was in his shirt pocket. His hand did not press it. For the first time, it simply rested there, quiet, at peace, like something that belonged to the past rather than something holding the present captive. Elk Hollow changed in the particular way of small towns that have been watching something happen before the people inside it have found a name for it. Old Emmett Burke called out from his chair every morning, not just to Silas now, but to Clara and the children when they rode in together. He called Rosie Little Miss, and she told him that was not her name. Her name was Rosie, and he laughed every single time. Opal Finch kept peppermints on the counter at a height Rosie could reach without asking. Rosie considered this a natural law of the universe. Harlan Prescott tipped his hat to Clara at the feed store and asked about the garden, and Clara gave him a precise, knowledgeable answer about soil drainage that left him nodding with respect. Ezra started working with the blacksmith on Tuesdays. The man told Caleb privately that the boy had the best instincts for metal work he had seen in a young person in 20 years. Rosie launched a campaign to rename Silas's horse, which was called simply the Bay. She considered this an outrage against naming conventions. After a week of relentless suggestions, Silas said with no perceptible expression, "Fine, Colonel." Rosie found this insufficiently creative. She named the horse Biscuit. Silas let it stand. The first Saturday after the hearing, the whole family went to Elk Hollow together. The first time, not Silas alone on horseback, not Clara with Jonah, all of them. Wagon Silas driving Clara beside him, Rosie and Ezra in the back, Caleb riding on the left, Jonah on the right. They stopped in front of Opal Finch's store, and Silas did something he had not done in 8 years. He offered his hand to help Clara step down from the wagon. Not a grand gesture, just a hand extended waiting so she could place hers in it and step to the ground. But it happened in front of the general store of Elk Hollow at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning where half the town could see, and Silas Hawthorne, the man who had not voluntarily touched another human being in 8 years, offered his hand to this woman as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Opal Finch stood in the doorway of her store watching, and she said nothing, but she smiled and she went inside and quietly moved the peppermint jar to the edge of the counter where small hands could reach. Jonah stood outside the post office telling stories to 3 cowboys from the Western Ranch, and when one of them asked, "So the mail order bride really stayed?" Jonah looked over his shoulder toward the store where Clara was helping Rosie pick out new ribbon, and he said, "She rode 4 days to Helena and back for our land papers. She tied a tourniquet on my brother when he took a bullet. She hauled water to fight a fire until her hands split open." He looked back at the 3 men. "She is not the mail order bride. She is a Hawthorne." It happened on a Thursday evening, ordinary in every way except one. Clara was in the kitchen making supper. Rosie was sitting on the floor beside her, the girl's preferred position for important conversations, telling Clara about a butterfly she had seen that day. Blue on one side, brown on the other, and how butterflies should pick one color because having 2 was confusing for everyone. Clara was cutting bread. She handed a piece to Rosie. "Thank you, Mama," Rosie said, and then she froze. Her eyes went wide. She looked at Clara with the expression of a child who has just said something enormous without meaning to and does not know whether what happened is allowed. Clara's hand went still on the bread knife. The kitchen was very quiet. "I am sorry," Rosie whispered. "I did not mean to. It just came out. I know you are Miss Clara. I know my mama is." She stopped. Her lower lip trembled. I am sorry. Clara set the knife down. She crouched to Rosie's level. She took the girl's small hands in both of hers. Rosie, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. You have a mama. Her name was Margaret. She was brave and she was kind, and she loved you more than anything in the world. Rosie's eyes were filling. And I am here, Clara said. I am right here, and I am not going anywhere. She did not say, you can call me Mama. She did not need to. What she said was larger than a title and more important than a word. It was a promise made in a kitchen with breadcrumbs on the floor, and the sun going down outside, and the sound of brothers coming in from the yard. Rosie launched herself forward, her small arms wrapped around Clara's neck with the ferocity of a child who has been waiting 8 years to hold someone this way. Clara caught her. She held her. From the doorway, because there was always someone in a doorway in this house at exactly the right moment, Silas stood. He had been watching. His face was doing something Clara had never seen. Something raw, something uncontrolled, something that had broken through every wall he ever built. Rosie pulled back. She looked at her father. Papa, she said with the directness that was entirely and purely Rosie, Miss Clara is staying forever. I decided. Silas looked at his daughter. He looked at Clara, who was kneeling on the kitchen floor, with tears on her cheeks and flour on her dress, in the most open expression he had ever seen on her face. I think, he said, and his voice was rough, that has already been decided. Rosie nodded, satisfied that the matter was administratively resolved, and returned to her butterfly story as though the most important conversation of 3 people's lives had not just taken place on a kitchen floor. Clara stood, went back to the bread. Her hands trembled, but differently this time. Not fear, the tremor of someone who has just received something so large, she is still learning the shape of it. Silas came into the kitchen, poured himself coffee, stood beside her at the counter, close, closer than usual, and said nothing. And the nothing was full, and the evening light through the window was gold. And somewhere in the yard, Caleb was teaching Ezra to read the stars, and Jonah was laughing at something the chickens did, and the house was noisy and warm and alive in exactly the way Meg had asked for in the letter he had not yet read. Not a monument, a life. That night, Silas did something he had not done in 8 years. He opened the locket, not to look at Meg's portrait. He looked at that every day, every night, the familiar ritual of remembering. He opened the back, the part he had sealed when she died and had not touched since. Behind the portrait, folded into a square so small it seemed impossible it could contain words, was a piece of paper. He knew it was there. Meg had placed it there in her final days when the fever had taken her body, but not yet her mind. She was a teacher. She had read enough to know what was happening to her. And she wrote something and folded it into the locket that Silas kept on the nightstand beside her bed and said, "Do not read it unless you need to." He had never read it. 8 years of carrying her final words without letting them reach him because he was afraid that whatever she had written would change something he was not ready to change. He unfolded the paper at the kitchen table, alone in the lamplight. Her handwriting, small, precise, the handwriting of a teacher. My dearest Silas, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have kept your promise not to read until you needed to. So I will say it here. Do not let the silence become our children's inheritance. They need laughter in that house, not just survival. They need someone who will read to them the way I read to them and sing the songs I sang, even if the voice is different. And you, my love, you need to let someone in, not to replace me. No one replaces anyone. But there is room in that heart of yours for more than grief. I knew that the day I met you when you were the most serious 20-year-old in the territory, and I made you laugh for the first time, and you looked at me like I had performed a miracle. Let someone make you laugh again. Let the children see you laugh. That is all I am asking. You promised me a life, Silas, not a monument. Live it. All my love forever and alongside whatever comes after Meg. Silas read the letter 3 times. The first time he could not see the words at the end because his vision had blurred. The second time he read with his jaw clenched and his chest tight and his hands flat on the table. The third time he read calmly, slowly, as if memorizing every word, and something in him that had been locked for 8 years finally fully irreversibly opened. Not all at once, not with a dramatic moment of release. It opened the way a door opens when you have been pushing against it for a long time and finally realize it was never locked. You were just pushing in the wrong direction. He folded the letter, put it back in the locket, closed the locket gently, sat for a long time. Then footsteps. Clara was in the doorway, a glass of water in her hand, heading back to bed. She stopped when she saw his face. Silas. He did not answer right away. He picked up the locket, not pressed hard against his palm the way he had always held it, held gently, the way you hold something you love when you are no longer afraid of losing it. She left me a letter, he said. Meg, inside the locket. She wrote it before she died. Clara did not move. She told me to let someone in. His voice was rough. She told me not to turn this house into a monument. Clara came to the table, sat across from him. She did not touch the locket. She did not need to. She sounds like someone who knew you very well, Clara said softly. Better than I knew myself. A pause. She would have liked you. She liked people who did not pretend. You said that before, the first time you told me about her. I meant it then. I mean it more now. They looked at each other across the table. The lamp flickered. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the windows. Vast, dark, ancient. I do not know how to do this, Silas said, plainly, without performance. I built walls for 8 years. The walls kept me alive, but they kept everything else out too. He looked at the locket. I do not know if there is anything worth finding underneath them. Clara looked at him with those blue eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing and expected him to be better than the walls he had built. You taught your son to swing a hammer, she said. You kept your wife's tomatoes alive for 8 years. You asked 4 people for help when you have never asked anyone for anything. You put yourself between your family and a man who could destroy you. You let Caleb ride to Helena with a hole in his shoulder, and you did not say a word when he came back because you understood. She paused. There is plenty worth finding underneath them. He held her gaze. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. Quietly, the way you do something you have been thinking about for a long time, and the act itself is simply the arrival of a decision already made. Her hand was small in his. Warm. Calloused from 5 weeks of work she had never done before in her life, and entirely sure of itself. He closed his fingers around it, and neither of them said anything else because there was nothing that words could add to what was already in this moment completely understood. On the last Saturday of August, Clara found Silas in the barn in the late afternoon. The light was golden and warm, coming through the slats in long diagonal lines that turned the dust motes into something that looked almost like the fireflies Rosie collected in jars and then released because Ezra told her they would die if she kept them. He was mending a harness. He looked up when she came in. She had something in her hand. She walked to the workbench and set it down. Her mother's cameo brooch, the one she had worn every day since she was 15, the one she pressed against her collarbone the way Silas pressed the locket against his palm, a habit so old it had become invisible. 2 people carrying their dead the same way without knowing it until they found each other. Silas looked at the brooch. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and set the locket on the workbench beside it. 2 objects, side by side on rough pine. 2 people who died and left behind pieces of themselves in the hands of people who loved them enough to carry those pieces every day for years. I do not need to figure everything out tonight, Clara said. No, he agreed, but I think we have already figured out the main thing. He looked at her. What is the main thing? She looked back at him with those clear, direct eyes. The eyes that had never once flinched from the first moment she stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty town and looked up at 3 enormous men and decided she was staying. That we are not alone anymore, she said. He held her gaze. Then he picked up the locket, opened it, looked at Meg's face, the face he had looked at every day for 8 years with love and grief and the deep specific gratitude of a man who knows what he had and will never diminish it by pretending it did not matter. He read the letter one last time. The letter that said, "You promised me a life, not a monument." He closed the locket gently, set it back on the workbench beside Clara's brooch. He took her hand. No, he said, we are not. From outside came the sound of Ezra calling for Rosie and Rosie answering at full volume with absolutely no consideration for the hour or the wildlife or the basic concept of an indoor voice. Jonah's laugh carried across the yard, big and easy and warm. Caleb's voice quieter, steadier. Rosie stopped chasing the chickens. The barn filled with the sounds of a family that had not existed 8 weeks ago, and now existed with the certainty of something that was always meant to be. Silas Hawthorne had spent 8 years building walls against the weather. What he discovered on that last Saturday of August in the barn behind the house that had become a home was that the weather had gotten in anyway. Not as destruction, but as something older and more stubborn than either grief or fear. Something that had simply waited with the patience of all true things until he was ready to let it be real. He had been ready, he understood now, for longer than he knew. He just needed someone who refused to walk away to show him where the door was. Clara Whitfield had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. What she found at the end of a dirt road in Montana Territory was not one husband, but a family. Not one heart to hold, but a household of them, battered and guarded and desperately in need of someone brave enough to stay. She was brave enough. She stayed. And on 3 peaks in the Montana mountains, as the summer of 1874 drew to its close, a house that had been silent for 8 years, filled with the sounds of people who had each lost something precious, beginning with extraordinary care to build something new. And that for this evening and all the evenings to come was more than enough.